The battlefield rested in a heavy silence after the end of the violent conflict. The surviving soldiers merely observed the carnage around them, exhausted by the slaughter and unaware of what the future held. Amidst the smoldering wreckage, a cynical and resigned voice questioned the options that still remained to them. The flames burned intensely, ready to consume the last vestiges of that relentless massacre. Without hesitation, an individual poured the contents of his canteen directly onto the crackling fire. The flammable liquid only served to further fuel the destruction that already plagued the desolate place. From atop the stone wall, a lone man watched the fire spreading below. He seemed unperturbed by the chaos and smoke rising to the skies. Turning his face to the horizon, the mercenary reflected with deep bitterness on the predictable nature of the nobility. For him, the selfish attitudes of the elite no longer caused any surprise. As he adjusted his garments, he recalled the false promises of titles and greatness that the powerful used to make. In the end, he realized that they all changed their tune when it suited them. The memory of others' hypocrisy caused an ironic and dark smile to appear on his face. The warrior found humor in his own misfortune and the lies that surrounded him. The man then calmly walked along the length of the wall again. However, he admitted aloud that the last revelation he had heard managed to surpass all previous betrayals. Stopping walking, the mercenary revealed a sharp and dangerous look. His expression showed that, despite the lies, he was perfectly prepared to deal with the consequences of that night. A few steps away, the real reason for his speech was revealed. The mercenary was face to face with an imposing knight in armor, who awaited him in silence under the dark sky. The knight maintained his rigid and authoritarian posture, wielding his weapon firmly. He faced his opponent with unwavering seriousness, representing the order that the other so despised. Without being intimidated by the mocking tone, the noble responded sharply. He made a point of asserting his position, making it clear that he had not forgotten the identity of the man in front of him. In response, the mercenary let out a laugh full of scorn, gesturing casually. He continued to mock the knight's attitude, feigning surprise at the noble's sudden hostility. Realizing that words would not be enough, the warrior reached for the hilt of his blade. He mentioned his fate as a mercenary, accepting that honorable death in battle was the only path. A lethal and reddish glow took over his eyes as a sadistic smile formed. The mercenary embraced the bloodlust, fully prepared to begin the deadly confrontation against the knight. The man in dark clothes watched the knight in the distance under the night sky. The atmosphere between the two carried a palpable tension, marking the beginning of a decisive encounter. The knight in armor, in turn, lowered his gaze in a moment of hesitation. He seemed to carry the weight of an overwhelming responsibility before finally gathering the courage to speak. Faced with that solemn posture, the man with the scar on his face only gave a restrained smile. He waited patiently, aware that the noble in front of him was about to reveal his true intentions. Breaking the silence, the warrior in the blue cloak revealed the true purpose of that meeting. He decided to entrust his interlocutor with a last and final mission, demonstrating the gravity of the situation. Upon hearing the proposal, the man with rustic features assumed a more attentive posture. He immediately understood that this was not just any job, but something of extreme importance. Turning his gaze to the horizon, the young man contemplated the destruction that was spreading below. The ruin of that place was already an inevitable fate, justifying the desperation of the request. The imminent threat came from the heavily armored enemy troops marching under an imposing banner. The military power of that rival family made it clear that any direct resistance would be completely useless. The listener maintained his unwavering expression as he processed the grim information. He absorbed every detail of the catastrophic scenario that the knight described, silently assessing the enormous risks involved in that task. As the symbols of the fortress crumbled amidst the flaming chaos, the noble interrupted his own speech. He quickly realized that he had been carried away by the despair of imminent defeat. However, the man in dark clothes dismissed the apologies with a casual gesture and a broad smile. He demonstrated unwavering confidence, encouraging the knight to get straight to the point. That sharp expression revealed an almost predatory excitement in the face of danger. The young man was clearly intrigued by the situation and eager to find out what his role would be in that disaster. Faced with that fearless attitude, the armored warrior regained his imposing posture. He prepared to detail the exact nature of the mission that would change the course of that tragic night. While awaiting instructions, the outsider tried to deduce what would be required of him. He pondered internally whether the outsider's deductions are interrupted by a frighteningly clear directive. The gravity of the situation is exposed bluntly, revealing the certainty that a total and imminent offensive by the traitors will occur the next day. The gravity of the warning materializes in the fall of the fortress, consumed by the chaos of a relentless attack. Where once there was a safe haven, now there are only ruins, and the certainty that the real battle has begun. The knight made a drastic decision in the face of imminent ruin. He declared his firm intention to fight to the end, accepting death on the battlefield as a perfectly acceptable outcome to honor his name. As a guarantee of his bold proposal, the noble revealed a scarlet jewel of inestimable value. He firmly believed that the immense wealth contained therein would be more than enough to buy the necessary loyalty. Without showing hesitation, the commander threw the precious stone to the mercenary leader. He argued with conviction that this generous payment would cover all the commander maintained a cold and impenetrable expression after the offer. Under the shadow that covered his face, he silently calculated whether the high price paid would guarantee the loyalty needed for his next steps. The mask of false cordiality finally shatters, giving way to a predatory fury. Offended by having his apparent sympathy mistaken for weakness, he reveals the true and lethal nature that has always been lurking. The predatory fury turns into absolute betrayal, transforming the battlefield into a scene of chaos and abandonment. Amidst the suffocating destruction, despair takes over the warriors as they realize the harsh reality. They have been reduced to mere disposable pawns, destined to bleed only to protect the one who deceived them. The shock of betrayal consumes any trace of humanity that still remained, giving way to a cold and uncontrollable fury. Sanity gives way to a purely murderous instinct, sealing a silent and terrifying promise of retaliation. The macabre execution scene serves as a brutal reminder that there will be no mercy. Faced with the sacrifice of their companions, the harsh reality crushes any naive illusion that their tormentors would allow a peaceful escape. The cold wind sweeps the wall, carrying the weight of the recent betrayal as two men from opposite worlds confront each other. The funereal silence is broken by a hesitant recognition, revealing that the survivor's true identity can no longer be hidden. The commander faces the harsh reality of his leadership, perfectly aware that the bought loyalty of his men will crumble as soon as he falls. This fatalistic realization is received with sadistic pleasure by his opponent, who already savors the imminent collapse of those forces. The shadow of betrayal finally gains a face, driven by a cruel and unmistakable anticipation. For predators awaiting a leader's fall, fragile loyalty is just the perfect invitation to begin the slaughter. The lethal gleam tears through the darkness, consummating the fall of the leader who now lies inert on the forest floor. For the executioner who waited in the shadows, any trace of mercy has been extinguished. What might have been respect has transformed into the cold determination to relentlessly strike down a sworn enemy. The sepulchral silence of the forest is broken by the rough sound of agony. Under the watchful eye of a nearby observer, the fallen warrior struggles for air, feeling the weight of the recent clash as death still lurks among the trees. The trembling hand rises in a last desperate plea for help. In response to the fallen warrior's agony, the armored figure advances with firm steps, shortening the distance to decide the fate of the one who languishes at his feet. Help finally reaches the exhausted warrior, who yields to the weight of battle under the shadow of the trees. As the last drop of strength leaves his fingers and the blade slips, the arrival of the cavalry in the background brings relief to the survivors. The initial attack was brutal and relentless. Without any prior warning, the blade tore through the soldier's heavy armor, scattering blood across the battlefield and instantly felling the first opponent. Behind the stained metal visor, the mysterious warrior's gaze shone with pure coldness. He showed no remorse for his violent actions, revealing his true, lethal nature. Upon realizing the enemy's true strength, the mounted knights hesitated. Panic began to spread rapidly through the ranks when they noticed they were dealing with a threat impossible to contain. Absolute terror took over the veteran commander's face. He finally understood that this would not be a common battle, but an imminent massacre from which they could not escape. In the blink of an eye, the masked warrior advanced with fury. His speed was completely inhuman, turning him into a deadly blur that cut through the air towards the stunned survivors. After the overwhelming attack, the executioner remained still, watching the carnage around him. The breathing under the helmet remained calm, proving that the combat did not require any real effort. With the enemy leadership completely decimated, a heavy silence fell over the combat site. The warrior then coldly announced his triumph, confirming that he had eliminated the commanders without mercy. Meanwhile, a tense discussion was taking place elsewhere. The mercenary provoked the armored knight, warning about the uncontrollable fury and the total. The grim warning about the uncontrollable fury had an immediate effect. A sudden hesitation cut through the tension, silencing any response that was about to be uttered. Disbelief strikes him as he realizes his opponent's true gamble. He questions the sanity behind that strategy, refusing to accept that someone would actually depend on such a risky plan. The tension of the moment now carries the weight of an almost absurd revelation. Far from being shaken by the disbelief of others, he absorbs the tension of the moment with a calculating coldness. The audacity of his strategy is far from madness, revealing itself to be a perfectly executed psychological trap to dominate the situation. Faced with the absolute impasse, Any trace of hesitation disappears under the weight of necessity. He coldly accepts that his extreme strategy has ceased to be a gamble and has become the only possible alternative. The weapon slips from his hand, marking the exact moment when reason is discarded in favor of survival. He abandons his conventional defenses, surrendering entirely to the abyss of his new and relentless strategy. Exchanging caution for pure aggressiveness, he fires off in a relentless charge against his target. The movement carries the weight of someone who bets his own life on a single explosive attack, forcing the opponent to await the imminent clash. The deep aversion to nobility culminates in a focused and cutting hatred against his target. The realization that the opponent represents the most vile scum of his class only fuels the relentless fury that drives his attack. The final confrontation seemed inevitable under the dark sky. One of the warriors offered his apologies solemnly, ensuring that his words carried a genuine weight of regret before the clash. However, the request for forgiveness was not well received. The opponent gripped the hilt of his sword tightly, moved by a deep anger against the one he considered a traitor. The dark-haired man kept his gaze fixed and full of rancor. He knew very well that the enemy was just waiting for the right moment to attack and would not back down. On the other side, the armored knight touched his own neck with extreme calm. He showed no sign of hesitation or fear in the face of the imminent threat that was forming. The masked warrior coldly revealed that he already expected resistance. He was quite certain that traps and preparations had been meticulously organized to try to stop their advance. The tension between the two adversaries reached its peak on top of the wall. The deadly clash was about to begin, without any possibility of a peaceful agreement between the parties. In a fulminating instant, a relentless hand covered the victim's face, emanating a lethal smoke. Life quickly faded away, sealing the tragic fate of that confrontation in the shadows for good. Later, in a completely different environment, a young man cried copiously. He wiped away his tears non-stop, dominated by an intense mixture of relief and despair after a great scare. In the bed in front of him, a blonde man suddenly woke up confused. The protagonist looked around the luxurious room, desperately trying to understand where he was and what had happened to him. The boy's expression showed a deep and silent shock. Nothing around him made the slightest sense to him, as if he had just woken up in a completely distorted reality. While the boy next to the bed lamented the master's near death, the newly awakened man tried to process the situation. He soon realized that there was something drastically wrong with all of this. Upon hearing the laments about the family's tragedy, the protagonist stared at his own hands in shock. The servant's words sounded like complete nonsense to his mind. Panic began to take over his mind in an overwhelming way. He tried to connect the pieces of an impossible puzzle, desperately searching for any trace. The shock of the transition deepens as he inspects his own body, revealing an immaculate skin that has never known hard work. This aristocratic softness is a reality completely foreign to the life he was sure he had lost, further fueling his confusion. Waking up in this new reality brings with it the unexpected weight of other people's emotions. While trying to process the situation, the desperate crying at the foot of the bed only deepens his total disorientation in the face of the unknown. The protagonist awoke to the sound of desperate crying. A young boy was grabbing his covers, sobbing uncontrollably. The man's mind, however, was still trapped in the memory of a death that should have been absolute and inescapable. Confused by the situation, he tried to process the desperate words coming out of the boy's mouth. However, the outpouring of lamentations made no sense to the disoriented mind of the newly awakened. As he sat up in bed, the man realized that the respectful titles used by the boy did not align with his true identity. That life of master and servant definitely did not belong to him. The young lackey continued his scandalous weeping, expressing the absolute terror he had felt moments before. The boy's genuine emotion made it clear that he truly believed he had lost his master in a tragic way. Kneeling next to the bed, the servant explained the weight of that near tragedy. The protagonist's death would not only ruin the lackey's life, but also bring devastating consequences for the entire noble family. While listening to the lamentations, the memory of his last moments came back with force. He was absolutely certain that his previous life had ended brutally and without any chance of salvation. Upon connecting the pieces of that bizarre puzzle, a silent and sharp realization took over his mind. The impossibility of his own survival led him to a single, absurd logical conclusion about his fate. Determined to confirm his suspicions, the protagonist cautiously got out of bed. He finally accepted the undeniable fact that his consciousness had somehow awakened inside the body of a complete stranger. In front of the bedroom mirror, he assessed his new appearance with obvious satisfaction. The reflection revealed striking and refined features, proving that, at least physically, this unexpected transition had been an excellent deal. The man then observed the reflection of the environment around him, with the lackey still waiting behind him. The opulence of the room confirmed that his new reality would be very different from the previous one. He approached the glass, inspecting every detail of his new face with a mixture of fascination and coldness. It was essential to quickly get used to this new identity to ensure his survival in this place. The extravagant richness of the decoration made it clear that he now belonged to a family of the highest nobility. Faced with this, the protagonist decided that his first step would be to collect crucial information about this world. In the mirror's reflection, his attention turned to the young lackey who was watching him. He began to rummage through the fragmented memories of that body, desperately trying to recall the boy's name. Noticing the sudden change in his master's posture, the servant reacted with obvious surprise and apprehension. The boy waited anxiously, without the slightest suspicion of the exchange of souls that had occurred. The nobleman turned abruptly, facing the lackey head-on. With a plan in mind, he prepared to begin the subtle interrogation that would dictate his next steps in this new life. The protagonist woke up with a start. Immense confusion took over his mind as he tried to process the reality around him after opening his eyes. The memories of his own death were still recent, however. He soon understood the impossible. The young man had returned in time, awakening exactly 15 years before his tragic end. Faced with the absurdity of the situation, the boy decided that panicking would solve nothing. He forced his mind to calm down, momentarily dealing with the presence of another individual in the room. His gaze became sharp and calculating. The protagonist began to coldly analyze the environment and the circumstances of his new chance at life. Meanwhile, the other boy present in the room recoiled, completely paralyzed. A wave of pure terror immediately hit him in the face of his master's sudden and intimidating posture. The lackey's nervousness was palpable in the air. He squeezed his own clothes tightly, unable to control the tremor that was taking over his body under that tension. Upon noticing the servant's attitude, the young man questioned the breach of protocol. He demanded to know if the rules of that place had changed to allow such insolence without prior permission. The pressure that the protagonist exerted was overwhelming. He assessed the subordinate with an implacable coldness, awaiting a justification for that intrusion. Under that silent scrutiny, the lackey felt the weight of his mistake. Absolute panic clouded any attempt at logical reasoning that he might have had. Without hesitation, the subordinate bowed abruptly in a gesture of total submission. He desperately tried to demonstrate respect and appease the wrath he believed he had provoked. Rushed and desperate words came out of his mouth. The lackey pathetically begged for forgiveness, fearing the worst consequences for his failure. The young nobleman, however, was caught by surprise. He observed the servant's exaggerated reaction, realizing that his own aura had caused a totally disproportionate dread. Outside those walls, the symbols of power fluttered imposingly in the wind. That territory carried an undeniable historical weight for the region. The grandeur of the property reflected the unquestionable influence of its residents. It was a domain built on centuries of wealth and absolute authority. That was the home of House Valdek, a noble lineage of immense prestige, recognized by all as one of the fundamental pillars that sustained the empire itself. The Valdek family possessed power and wealth that rivaled even the imperial lineage. The patriarch ruled his territory with absolute and unquestionable influence. The grandeur of the property reflected this elevated status. The imposing gates of the mansion remained constantly guarded, demonstrating that no one dared to challenge the dominion of that house. However, the protection routine was monotonous for the guards. The tranquility of the place made it clear that real threats were rare in those peaceful lands. Far from there, the protagonist woke up in shock. He realized that he had returned to his old workplace, but now occupied the body of the third son of House Valdek. Bitter memories flooded his mind. In his previous life, the young man suffered constant humiliations and was treated with contempt just because of his humble origins. That past existence was marked by irreparable losses and much violence. He walked through lonely cemeteries, carrying the weight of death and tragedy on his shoulders. To survive, the warrior needed to toughen up. He drowned his sorrows and exhaustion amidst desolate scenarios, accepting the harshness of his miserable destiny. At the moment of his death, a last thought consumed him. He fell into the abyss, questioning how far he could have gone if he had received the same opportunities as the privileged. And then, the miracle happened. The soul of the hardened man fragmented and merged with the reality of the young nobleman, uniting a bloody past with a promising future. Upon opening the windows, he felt the warmth of the sun confirm that it was not a dream. The protagonist decided to fully embrace this second chance that fate had granted him. Without wasting time, the nobleman began to move around the vast property. He walked through the luxurious corridors, closely accompanied by one of the mansion's servants. Upon encountering the house staff, he maintained a firm posture. The young man noticed the suspicious and judgmental looks of the employees, but did not back down. At that moment, he recalled the coldness of the family patriarch. The memory of being ignored in bed while he was sick reinforced the emotional distance that existed in that house. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted. The protagonist noticed an unexpected approach, while the servant next to him showed obvious surprise at someone's arrival. It was then that the head butler, Edwin, introduced himself. The experienced man exhibited an impeccable posture, representing the authority and strict order that governed the Valdic mansion. The young man tried to maintain a relaxed posture in front of the older employee. He was sure his recent actions wouldn't go unnoticed, but decided to act naturally to deflect any suspicion about the situation. With a confident smile, the protagonist tried to justify his actions to the man in front of him. He gestured smoothly, creating quick excuses that seemed perfectly plausible in his own mind to avoid further questioning. The grey-haired employee, however, remained in absolute silence. That impassive and serious look clearly showed that the man wasn't believing any of the flimsy excuses the boy was trying to sell. Then, the older man closed his eyes with a serene expression. He already knew exactly how to conduct that conversation, preparing to deliver the final blow to the boy's confidence. Completely oblivious to the imminent danger, the young man continued laughing casually. He genuinely believed that he had successfully circumvented the problem, and would get out of that uncomfortable situation without suffering any serious consequences. Determined to end the matter once and for all, the protagonist turned his back and began walking towards the exit. He waved dismissively, considering the conversation completely over. However, the butler's firm voice cut through the air, interrupting the escape. With polite but authoritative words, the man demanded the immediate attention of his young master. The boy's step faltered instantly in the middle of the hall. Hearing the somber tone coming from behind, he froze in place, realizing clearly that his attempt to escape had failed miserably. Looking over his shoulder, a chill ran down the protagonist's spine. The sudden summons that the butler conveyed carried a terrifying weight that he couldn't ignore. Shortly after, the young man found himself in front of an imposing office desk. The atmosphere in the room was overwhelming, and the figure sitting in front of him exuded an oppressive authority. The family patriarch stared at him from the shadows of his luxurious chair. The imposing presence of his father was terrifying, marking the entire environment with a heavy aura of absolute power and silent cruelty. The boy remained motionless in the center of the room, unable to take a single step forward. The weight of the man's gaze seemed to crush any remaining courage he still possessed. Cold sweat ran quickly down the protagonist's tense face. He swallowed hard, feeling dread take over every muscle in his body as he silently awaited the imminent judgment. The patriarch's voice finally echoed through the silent hall, sounding cold and cutting. The dark question that came from his lips showed no paternal concern, but rather a deadly and calculating disdain. When questioning his son's suicide attempt, the older man made his absolute contempt clear. To him, the boy's survival seemed to be just an irritating inconvenience. The young man was summoned to the main office. In front of the imposing desk, he awaited the older man's words, feeling the oppressive weight of the environment and the tension that hung in the air. However, the first sentence spoken caught him completely by surprise. The boy could barely process the sudden information, mentally questioning whether he had heard that statement correctly, as it seemed to make no sense. The patriarch, however, maintained his rigid posture. He made it clear that he would not tolerate excuses, warning that this would be the boy's last opportunity to explain himself and take responsibility for his mistakes. The conversation took a dark turn when it touched on old wounds. The man revealed that he was willing to forgive his son's negligence and rebellion, even knowing that he used his mother's mourning as justification. The tension in the air became even more palpable. The contained frustration was evident in the force with which his fingers gripped the furniture, demonstrating that this man's patience was wearing thin. It was then that the real accusation came to light. The elder reprimanded him harshly, stating that the prolonged isolation had not been the worst, but rather the alleged attempt to take his own life. Hearing those words, the protagonist froze in place. The gravity of the allegation hit him hard, leaving him completely perplexed by a dark narrative that he seemed to be completely unaware of. Immediately, fragmented memories invaded his confused mind. He recalled the moment when he was recently bedridden, while an acquaintance leaned over him, crying desperately and completely uncontrollably. The memory of that person's scandalous crying and despair finally made sense. He realized the real reason for so much fuss and suffering around his bed in those dark days. The young man put his hand to his chest, feeling the impact of the revelation. He finally understood the terrible conclusion that everyone in the house had drawn about his recent state of health. On the other side of the table, the authority figure demanded absolute answers. He ordered the boy to expose once and for all the dark feelings he had been keeping secret. The protagonist remained motionless, staring at the man in front of him. He needed to quickly find the right words to defend himself against that overwhelming accusation that now weighed on his shoulders. The patriarch's firm posture demonstrated that the judgment had already been made in his mind. He was only waiting for a confession, maintaining absolute and unwavering control of the situation in the office. The final sentence was delivered with extreme cruelty. The man detailed the alleged attempt, accusing the boy of having swallowed sleeping pills in a cowardly, desperate, and completely intentional manner. The weight of those words crushed any attempt at an immediate response. The young man absorbed the absurd accusation in silence, realizing with horror that his own family believed in a suicide attempt. Rumors echoed through the corridors of the imposing mansion. The local nobility whispered non-stop about the recent tragic events, eagerly awaiting any news that came from behind those large closed doors. It was exactly in that dark time that the tragedy materialized definitively. The coffin surrounded by white flowers marked the premature end of a life that, tragically, had barely begun. The family patriarch maintained a rigid and absolutely implacable posture in the face of everything. As head of that noble house, the man ruled his domains with an iron fist and no empathy. The leader's lineage was quite complex, composed of 4 completely distinct heirs. Each of the boys had been born to a different mother, which inevitably created a web of rivalries. Among the imposing older brothers, the youngest was constantly marginalized and ignored. The brutal difference in power and influence left the young man in a position of clear disadvantage in the family dispute. Rejected by those who should have been his blood, the boy ended up completely isolated in the shadows of his own house. Deep loneliness quickly became his only and constant daily companion. However, the true and devastating blow came with the loss of his only protector. Heavy mourning took over the environment when the painful moment of the final farewell finally arrived. The heavy coffin was sealed, forever hiding the face of his beloved mother. That wooden lid represented the absolute end of any affection that the boy still possessed. Realizing that he was truly alone in the world, the shock paralyzed the boy completely. The harsh reality of his new and dangerous situation collapsed heavily on his fragile shoulders. The tragic death of his mother and his unstable position in the family hierarchy were too heavy a burden. The boy succumbed to the deepest despair, totally unable to withstand so much psychological pressure. Suffocating anguish consumed his mind in a relentless and cruel manner. Constant tears of pain and extreme frustration quickly pushed him to the edge of his sanity during that dark period. For over a long year, deep mourning destroyed his already fragile health. The young man's body slowly withered in bed, completely without the strength to continue fighting. Unable to resist, surrounded by the silence of the Grand Library, the young noble finds himself cornered by an awkward situation. The break in his composure is subtle, but the exasperation shines through clearly as he is forced to deal with the consequences of what he has just heard. The summons tears him from the refuge of the library, placing him directly under the scrutiny of the house's highest authority. Facing the imposing figure awaiting him on the other side of the table, the young man understands that the moment of reckoning has finally arrived. Settled in his imposing chair, the elder noble reflected in deep silence. He seriously pondered the extreme anguish the other must be facing at such a delicate moment. Meanwhile, the young man swallowed hard, struggling to maintain his composure. The tension in the atmosphere was palpable, evidencing the deep nervousness that consumed him inside before speaking. In his mind, the boy felt he was on the verge of ruin. Frustration took over his thoughts as he believed he had one foot in the grave due to the current situation. Anger overflowed into the physical world uncontrollably. The young man stomped his foot on the ground with such force that he demonstrated an aggressive impatience, unable to contain the storm of emotions. He imagined the worst possible scenario for his future. The boy saw himself exiled to a distant monastery, forced to live a life of false devotion and absolute isolation. The terrifying vision of his destiny continued to haunt him. The young man imagined himself suffering in frozen lands, desperately running from wild beasts in a miserable and completely hopeless existence. Upon realizing that he could not accept this fate, a dark determination took over him. The boy decided that he would do whatever it took to change the course of his life. Facing the patriarch head-on, he finally took action. The young man declared firmly that he would express his thoughts with complete clarity, refusing to back down before the older man's authority. However, he quickly masked his rebellion with pure formality. The boy gave a polite bow, placing his hand on his chest to demonstrate a false respect as he prepared his next and bold argument. Nearby, one of the advisors present observed the scene in shock. The gray-haired man simply could not hide his perplexity at the unexpected audacity the boy was demonstrating. The elder noble, however, remained absolutely calm. He thoughtfully brought his hand to his chin, carefully analyzing the young man's words and defiant posture before him. A genuine doubt arose in the patriarch's mind. He questioned the boy's tone, trying to deeply understand if there was any real reason for that attitude, or if it was just pure insolence. A heavy silence hung over the luxurious office after the declaration. The young man patiently awaited the response, maintaining his firm and unwavering posture before the family leader's imposing desk. To further reinforce his determination, the boy adjusted his stance on the floor. He moved his feet slightly, physically preparing himself for any adverse reaction that might follow in that confrontation. Lucian addressed the older man with an absolutely unwavering posture. The young man made an unusual request for support, demonstrating a confidence he definitely did not possess before. He awaited the response with a calm smile on his face. Hesitation and constant fear were no longer part of his attitude towards the imposing paternal figure. The Archduke of Valdek was taken by surprise by the audacity. The sudden request for words of encouragement sounded completely absurd and out of place to the veteran noble. Beside him, one of the servants observed the interaction with evident tension and apprehension. Absolutely no one. The imposing figure assesses the environment, perfectly aware of the drastic change hanging in the air. Before the young subordinate, he reflects on the new and silent tension that has just settled in the hall. Consumed by a dense and chaotic aura, young Master Lucian's posture exudes a disturbing torment. Faced with this dark transformation, disbelief takes over those who observe him, questioning whether that unrecognizable figure is still the boy they knew. The memory of the fragile boy who once recoiled from any challenge is shattered by his new posture. Disbelief hangs in the air as the unwavering confidence he now exudes completely erases the traces of his former cowardice. The impact of that transformation hits the man squarely, making his heart race in a mixture of shock and apprehension. The shadow of the weak boy fades from his mind, replaced by the weight of a presence that now demands to be taken seriously. The magnitude of the transformation hits him head-on, leaving him momentarily paralyzed. The accelerated beat of his own heart is the only response his body can give to that new and imposing presence. Seeking an anchor for the reality that seems to crumble, he clings firmly to the nearest surface. The silent tension in his fingers is the only external reflection of the turmoil that consumes him. The dense silence weighs on his face, masking the internal turbulence under a stoic facade. The tense jaw reveals the silent determination of one who refuses to yield to the imminent chaos. Replacing the coldness with a calculated courtesy, he offers a serene smile that seeks to disarm the environment. The gentle gesture over his chest acts as a perfect mask of apparent sincerity, skillfully burying any trace of previous tension. The subtle smile that forms on his lips is a perfectly calculated mask. By keeping his gaze hidden, he ensures that none of his true intentions shine through, maintaining a facade of false cordiality. Away from prying eyes, the accumulated tension finally takes its toll, and the mask of control crumbles. A shaky sigh of relief floods him as he tries to calm his racing heart, exhausted by the weight of sustaining his own farce. The imposing image of the Archduke of Valdek resurfaces in memory, but the pomp of his position does not deceive those who know his true essence. Behind the facade of nobility and authority hides only the pathetic nature of a cowardly rat. The noble lord maintained a rigid posture in his imposing office. He waited patiently for the words that would be said next, assessing the situation with his usual severity and unquestionable authority. Before him, the young man gathered all the courage he possessed. The boy took a deep breath in the middle of the great hall, mentally preparing himself to make a request that would certainly sound unusual to his family. A sudden memory crossed the protagonist's mind. He narrowed his eyes for a brief moment, focusing intensely on images of a distant past that still burned alive in his memory. In his deep thoughts, the image of a blade wielded with mastery and enveloped in an aura of energy took shape. That represented the symbol of absolute strength that he longed to achieve. The vision of a relentless warrior cutting through the skies in the middle of a bloody battle completely dominated his mind. That was the exact level of destructive power that the boy needed to recover. Suddenly snapping back to reality, the young man put his hand to his chest to calm his racing heart. He then declared his final decision with unexpected firmness, surprising even himself with such conviction. The patriarch immediately questioned the choice, doubting that someone with such a frail physique could wield a weapon. However, the protagonist admitted his current weakness, reaffirming that he would overcome his body's limitations. The noble lord listened to the unusual justification in absolute silence. He seriously pondered the boy's words, noticing a spark of genuine conviction that he didn't usually see in his behavior. In his mind, after not accepting the current result, the authority figure firmly demands that the process be repeated. His subordinate, maintaining a formal posture, receives the abrupt order with obvious surprise. The unexpected firmness of the order takes the experienced lackey by surprise, shaking his polished professional demeanor for a moment. Faced with the inflexible demand, he hesitates for a split second before formulating his response. The unforeseen firmness of the order shatters the experienced lackey's mask of politeness. Accustomed to dictating the pace of interactions, he finds himself momentarily disarmed by an authority he didn't expect to face. Faced with the unquestionable authority before him, the only possible response is absolute submission. The lackey swallows his pride and yields to the pressure, bowing to accept the orders imposed on him and acknowledging who truly holds the power in the room. The sudden submission catches him completely off guard, shattering any expectations he had of the situation. Faced with the unusual scene, he is left with only genuine bewilderment, completely unable to process the drastic change in attitude before him. The workers' joint effort reveals the considerable weight of the load they are carrying. The subtle glow accompanying the chest suggests that its interior holds something of immense value, possibly the tribute demanded after their unexpected surrender. The heavy chest was finally opened, revealing a shimmering mountain of gold coins and precious jewels. It was an incalculable fortune stored inside, exceeding any expectation that could exist. The young blonde stared at the treasure with absolute disbelief, while his companion trembled right behind him. He could hardly believe the amount he saw, finding the whole situation truly absurd. Observing the grandeur of the property around him, the boy began to understand the true weight of power. He finally understood the scale of what it meant to belong to the high nobility. Letting the coins slip through the intoxicating fascination of the newly acquired wealth elicits dark laughter of pure greed from him. For him, that shimmering gold represents much more than purchasing power. It is the ultimate key to completely transforming and enhancing his current and miserable physical condition. The real treasure, however, is not the gold itself, but the source from which it springs. That single mystical creation, distilled to perfection, carries the weight of incalculable riches and the promise of absolute power. Under the serene light of the glass refuge, cruel whispers reveal the weight of the Archduchess's son's lineage. The unwavering belief in the master's love for the child makes the reality of his supposed abandonment even more pathetic and desolate. The noble's imposing march through the greenhouse contrasts bitterly with the pathetic image painted by the whispers. As he advances with unwavering authority, the memory of the boy's always terrified gaze lingers in the air, revealing the silent fracture within that prestigious lineage. Immersed in memories of pure domination, the noble savors the memory of the submissive terror he used to inspire with ease. Behind him, the servant watches him with silent caution, feeling the weight of the relentless aura emanating from his master. Following the newcomer's departure through the garden, the observer is forced to swallow his frustration at such an unwavering stance. The man's imposing presence clashes brutally with the fragile submission he expected to find, shattering the illusion of control brought by his recent memories. With a smile full of presumption, he reevaluates his impressions of the man who just left. The realization that that individual's maternal heritage went far beyond mere appearance awakens in him a mixture of surprise and arrogant intrigue. Leaving the weight of other people's evaluations behind, the two walk together towards the clarity of the winter garden. The walk side by side marks a moment of silent complicity, momentarily moving away from the intrigues that surround them. The illuminated environment of the garden welcomes them as a serene refuge from the judgments of the outside world. The firm sound of footsteps echoes through the glass space, marking the transition to a moment of peace where only mutual company matters. The steady rhythm of the walk is suddenly interrupted, breaking the tranquility of the moment. A silent tension takes over their posture, indicating that something unexpected has crossed their path in the supposed refuge. The abrupt interruption of the steps immediately attracts the attention of the lackey, who remains in strict readiness. Amidst the serenity of the environment, the servant's formal posture acknowledges the authority of the one who has just arrived, silently awaiting his orders. The noble walked slowly, immersed in his thoughts. He reflected on a drastic change in behavior, noting that the young man's attitude was completely different from the submission he expected to find. The old butler listened to the ponderings with extreme attention. He seemed slightly surprised by his master's line of reasoning regarding that unexpected and complex situation. The aristocrat, however, displayed a rather confident demeanor. He seemed extremely pleased with his own conclusions about the boy's true nature and hidden potential. Meanwhile, the two continued their walk through the vast winter garden. The servant maintained a respectful distance, only silently awaiting his superior's next orders. The conversation soon turned to the boy's performance. The servant cautiously argued that the young master only seemed to have fallen behind compared to the other heirs. The patriarch stopped in the middle of the path, surrounded by flowers. He had to admit that, despite the apparent flaws, the blood of his lineage still ran strong in the boy's veins. A presumptuous and calculating smile appeared on the older man's face. He finally realized that the dispute in his family could be much more interesting than he had anticipated. Resuming the dialogue, the Lord made it clear that the obstacles in that boy's path were extremely serious. He stated with conviction that such problems would never be solved with empty words alone. Upon realizing the weight and gravity of those words, the employee swallowed hard. A drop of sweat ran down his face, highlighting the enormous tension that the subject brought. The reality of that power struggle involved much crueler methods. The price to be paid for any mistake would be collected with gold and, inevitably, with much bloodshed. Elsewhere, a mysterious young man was destroying crucial evidence. He held a sealed letter as the flames consumed the paper, quickly erasing any trace of the message he had just received. Back in the tranquility of the greenhouse, the aristocrat clicked his tongue, demonstrating a sudden and deep irritation. The butler watched his master's change of mood with great caution. The lord crossed his arms quickly, adopting a much more rigid and defensive posture. He seemed visibly bothered by the dangerous direction that recent events were taking. Faced with the imminent impasse, the servant took the initiative to advise him. He suggested directly and respectfully that his master should get involved. The serenity of the garden serves as a backdrop for a relentless reflection. Far from any pity, the conclusion is cold and logical. The third party involved is only suffering the inevitable consequences for allowing himself to be hit by such trivial tricks. The older man reflected in silence. An important decision about the future of his lineage weighed heavily on his shoulders. The heritage of House Valdek carried great power. However, he knew that blood alone was not enough. One had to forge their own destiny with their own hands. Some days passed after that realization. The family's imposing estate dawned under a restless and unusual atmosphere. Through the corridors, the servants whispered worrying rumors. Meanwhile, one of the servants ran desperately, trying to understand the newest confusion involving his master. The boy was at the end of his patience. Frustration took over him as he came across the irresponsible attitude that awaited him. In the courtyard, the young master displayed his latest and most extravagant order. Heavy boxes had been unloaded under the morning sun, drawing everyone's attention. The contents revealed to be an incalculable fortune. Gold coins and precious artifacts overflowed, evidencing a colossal and sudden expense. The lackey swallowed hard, completely stunned. He watched the noble with apprehension, fearing the disastrous consequences of such ostentation. The heir, in turn, remained focused only on his new acquisition. He completely ignored the shock and concerns of his subordinate. Faced with that absurd scene, the servant could not hold back his tears. Despair over his lord's imminent financial ruin struck him hard. Oblivious to the servant's suffering, the protagonist let the wealth run through his fingers. The feeling of absolute power completely intoxicated him. An ambitious and calculating smile appeared on his face. The young man already had very clear and obscure plans on how to use all that fortune. The true objective of that expense was soon revealed. He had ordered a mysterious flask, containing a magical substance of inestimable value. Later, isolated in the shadows of his chambers, the noble began a secret process. He concentrated intensely on the experiment he needed to perform. The procedure demanded a lot of his physical and mental energy. As he wiped the sweat from his forehead, he realized that the first and crucial step of his plan was complete. The young man watched the closed door, reflecting on the unwavering loyalty of his lackey. He knew perfectly well that Hans was full of doubts, but the guard continued to follow his orders without question. Alone in his makeshift laboratory, the boy turned his attention to the heavy alchemy table. There was a lot of work to be done with the various flasks, materials, and notes scattered around the place. His thoughts wandered to the darkness of the night outside. He had tirelessly searched for an absurdly expensive plant, known in myths to bloom only under the direct glow of moonlight. It was the mystical, moonlit herb. It was a mysterious and incredibly beautiful plant, whose real uses had not yet been properly understood or established by the greatest experts in that world. The blonde closed his eyes for a brief moment, silently pondering the risks of his plan. He even considered that there would still be time to back away from that madness before it was too late. However, when facing the heavy sacks full of that peculiar plant, his determination spoke louder. At that moment, the raw material might even seem like just a pile of weeds without any value, but he knew the hidden truth there. The protagonist slowly opened his eyes, revealing a sharp and calculating look from someone who saw a potential far beyond what was obvious. An uncontrollable wave of euphoria took over his mind as he imagined the near future. He saw himself metaphorically surrounded by the unlimited and lucrative potential of those mystical shining flowers. Ambition overflowed into an almost manic smile. The young man was absolutely certain that the price of that commodity would skyrocket soon, guaranteeing him an incalculable fortune in the market. Realizing that he was getting carried away by the excitement, he cleared his throat softly to disguise it. The boy recomposed his posture immediately, returning to focus on the practical and dangerous task at hand. The extraction process required extreme patience and precision. First, the delicate flowers needed to be hung and dried carefully in the environment to preserve all their hidden magical properties. Later, the prepared material was taken directly to the fire. He toasted the leaves of the moonlit herb, starting an innovative refining technique that... The application of that innovative technique transcended a simple experiment. It was a unique and irrevocable bet. an absolute risk where success or ruin depended on that exact moment. The moment of truth materializes before him, demanding a final action. By reaching out for the flask, the fate of that irrevocable bet is sealed. There is no more room for hesitation, only the acceptance of the absolute risk contained in that small container. The supreme prize of that dangerous bet finally rests in his hands. Before the legendary divine essence, his unwavering confidence makes it clear that true power is now under his control. With the breaking of the seal, the confined power finally awakens. The volatile essence escapes, ready to reveal its true nature. The sight of the volatile essence finally freed brings a dark amusement. With the newly awakened power pulsing under his control, the certainty of success manifests in a silent satisfaction. The incandescent mark imposes the most implacable law of this world, permanently wounding the flesh with the weight of an inescapable destiny. It is a brutal reminder that each individual's potential is sealed in the first breath, condemning them to a rigid hierarchy that society deems impossible to break. The weight of destiny now manifests in cold and implacable shackles, sealing any hope of escape. Freedom is nothing more than an illusion undone for the one who has been definitively condemned. The very essence of the soul writhes, being slowly devoured by the implacable immensity that surrounds it. The last breath of resistance dissolves into the ether, confirming that surrender to the abyss is the only remaining destiny. The absolute force that consumed even the last trace of resistance finally reveals its true nature. That overwhelming presence, capable of devouring the very soul, was none other than nectar. The true impact of that overwhelming force went beyond mere submission. Under its relentless influence, even those completely devoid of talent were shaped and transformed into perfectly usable swordsmen. The true source of such dominion did not need to be wielded on the battlefield, but rather contained in a simple flask. That shimmering essence held the power to bend wills and seal destinies, offering silent and absolute control. In a silent judgment, arrogance mixes with the certainty of the absolute power he holds under control. The young noble's complete ignorance of the true threat contained in that flask is, for now, his only and fragile luck. The forbidden knowledge took its price in blood, marking the brutal annihilation of the alchemist's guild. The ambition to master the nectar recipe threatened the absolute order of the empire, turning what would be the pinnacle of power into an immediate death sentence. The relentless search for answers clings to a single, mysterious container that survived the tragedy. That fragile flask seems to hold not only the secrets of the nectar, but also the dark echo of the lives consumed by it. Although the paths are finally open, the reality before him defies all logic. A deep confusion takes over his mind as he desperately tries to understand the bizarre situation unfolding. The spiral of confusion is suddenly broken by a paralyzing shock. Faced with the illogical scenario, even that predatory gaze falters, capturing the exact moment when the terrible reality finally dawns. The apparent tranquility of the village contrasts violently with the tension of the moment. The echo of a strict and prohibitive order hangs in the air, making it clear that an unforgivable boundary has just been crossed. Now, the weight of this disobedience threatens to shatter the illusory peace of the place. The warmth of the evening offers a silent refuge for the restless mind that observes the world through the window pane. The tension finally gives way to a solitary outburst, revealing the weight of the anguish that consumed her in secret. The young man paced back and forth in the empty hallway. Anxiety consumed him as he waited before the large closed doors, deeply fearing what might have happened in silence. Suddenly, a sound from the heavy door caught his attention. The boy abruptly stopped his pacing, his heart racing with anticipation of what was to come. The heavy doors finally opened. An imposing figure emerged at the entrance, revealing himself to the outside world after the long and agonizing period of absolute isolation. Upon recognizing his master, the boy couldn't contain his emotions. He poured out all his despair, tearfully questioning if the man had any idea how much time had passed. The accumulated anguish overflowed into a loud and uncontrolled cry. The servant explained how terrifying it was to receive absolutely no response during that long wait. Little by little, he tried to calm down and wipe his wet face. Wiping away the tears, the young man struggled to regain his composure and posture before his superior. The master, however, approached with extreme tranquility. He touched the boy in a comforting way, recognizing and embracing the genuine concern that his subordinate had shown. Far from looking exhausted, the man displayed a serene and welcoming smile. "Eya?" The sudden approach shattered any expectations the young man might have had. Caught completely off guard in the imposing hall, he could barely disguise his apprehension at the unexpected presence. The sudden invasion of his personal space leaves him cornered in an awkward situation. Surrounded by an overwhelming wave of investigative curiosity, he struggles to maintain his composure as he is scrutinized like a peculiar specimen. Far from feeling bothered by the sudden invasion of space, a silent amusement takes over him. He welcomes the curiosity of others with a resigned calm, allowing himself a moment of reflection as he peacefully yields to the situation. The absence of repudiation catches him completely by surprise. Faced with that unexpected calm, his initial curiosity quickly dissolves into genuine and silent bewilderment. The bewilderment soon translates into an undeniable physical reaction. He brings his hand to his chest, as if needing to confirm the suddenly accelerated rhythm of his own heart in the face of that unexpected outcome. The frenetic rhythm in his chest is not just adrenaline, but the epicenter of a drastic metamorphosis. An overwhelming energy rewrites the essence of his heart, forcing an evolution at a speed that defies reason itself. The internal turbulence finally ceases, giving way to an unshakable calm. The energy that once threatened to consume him now rests under his absolute control, marking the conclusion of his awakening with a silent confidence. Firm and heavy steps echoed through the silent environment. Someone had just arrived at the location, marking their presence in an imposing manner and demonstrating a posture of undeniable authority. The young man lowered his gaze slowly, letting out a contained and mysterious smile. He seemed extremely pleased with the situation unfolding around him. In his mind, he saw himself as the main and most powerful piece of a game. The noble took absolute control of the situation, feeling completely unshakable. A cunning thought crossed his mind at that moment. The boy touched his lips delicately, barely able to hide the amusement and malice in the face of his own plans. Without any prior warning, he quickly approached Hans. The employee recoiled slightly, clearly caught off guard and intimidated by his superior's sudden attitude. The noble then grabbed the boy's shoulders with extreme firmness. The abrupt and domineering action left the humble employee completely cornered, tense, and without any reaction. Further shortening the distance between them, he stared deeply at his subordinate. The redhead swallowed hard, feeling the full weight of that silent and oppressive intimidation. A dark and predatory expression took over the young man's face. He revealed a terrifying facet, internally amused by the genuine dread he caused in the other. His amusement only increased with each passing second. The noble seemed to feed on the despair of others, demonstrating an almost sadistic pleasure in that moment of extreme tension. Satisfied with the cruel game, he abruptly walked away. The boy expressed a false envy towards Hans, leaving the poor servant completely confused and stunned. Later, the two walked side by side along a wooded path. The noble continued with an extremely relaxed posture, enjoying the tranquility of the surrounding environment. A smile of pure and genuine satisfaction never left his face. He savored every second of his new reality, feeling untouchable and at peace with himself. In his mind, recent memories of pure luxury came to the surface. He reflected on the lavish banquets and the absolute comfort of having servants catering to all his whims. The weight of memories of a past marked by hunger contrasts brutally with his new reality of abundance, dominating him completely. This sudden and overwhelming wave of gratitude brings him to tears, leaving his companion completely perplexed by such commotion. The intensity of this clash of realities overflows into a palpable tension. He clenches his hands tightly, struggling to anchor his mind in the present and not be swallowed by the ghosts of misery. The noble adjusted his clothes calmly, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. He needed to maintain his composure and elegance in the face of the new reality he now faced. In his mind, he recalled a crucial memory about a specific guard of the Valdek family, known by the name of Jake. That individual seemed to have a hidden importance in recent events. The young man pondered silently about the information he possessed. He analyzed each detail carefully, trying to connect the dots of that confusing story full of gaps that surrounded him. Upon realizing that his old post had been taken by AI, faced with the usurpation of his place, the response is silent, but charged with intention. With a firm gesture, he concentrates his determination around the small artifact, preparing for the next step. The weight of usurpation takes its toll, turning initial determination into suffocating anxiety. Clinging to his last hope, absolute focus on the artifact becomes a silent, desperate plea to reverse his fate. The stifling tension finally overflows, manifesting in uncontrollable tremors that shatter any illusion of control. The sudden display of vulnerability catches his companion completely off guard, revealing the harsh reality of the moment. The abrupt movement draws his immediate attention, causing him to turn towards the source of the disturbance. His analytical gaze assesses the sudden loss of control, maintaining an unwavering calm that sharply contrasts with the stifling tension of the moment. Under the weight of that analytical gaze, the young man's courage falters. He shrinks into his own anxiety, unable to disguise his nervousness before the imposing figure addressing him. The somber atmosphere of the training yard serves as the stage for an inevitable confrontation. A voice echoes through the area, confronting the young man about breaking his old promise to never set foot in those domains. The tension explodes in a display of shock and pure indignation, shattering any expectation of a calm dialogue. Faced with the uncontrolled fury, the target of the attack reacts with an exasperating indifference, appearing genuinely confused about the reason for so much commotion. The weight of that sudden fury falls mercilessly on the young man, crushing any trace of courage. Intimidated by the outburst of anger, he hesitates, completely paralyzed, and unable to formulate a response in the face of such hostility. The hesitation takes a brutal toll, sealed in blood. Under the overwhelming weight of that fury, the second young master falls inert, leaving only heavy breathing in the wake of the violence. What should be a simple sword training reveals itself as a pretext for a relentless punishment. Under the oppressive shadow of his aggressor, the young master experiences the bitter reality of his own vulnerability and defeat. The training ground turns into the stage for a sadistic private spectacle. Watching with a disturbing calm, the aggressor treats the relentless punishment as mere casual entertainment. His superiority is unquestionable, evidencing the absolute control he exerts over the situation. A calm voice cut through the air, breaking the tense silence. The speaker demonstrated a perfect understanding of the reason for so much concern in that moment of pure uncertainty, trying to calm things down. The young redhead swallowed hard, clearly tense about the direction of the conversation. He couldn't hide his nervousness and apprehension about what he was about to face in that place. Firm steps sounded across the dirt floor, breaking the hesitation. The movement indicated that someone was taking charge of the situation with complete confidence and determination to advance towards the objective. The blonde protagonist took over. The tranquility of the imposing hall is suddenly broken. A sharp metallic clang echoes through the environment, cutting off the idle conversation and abruptly announcing that the calm has come to an end. The abrupt disruption of tranquility demands immediate answers. Maintaining a formal posture, the man hurries to relay the information to his superior, aware that the situation now requires full attention. The urgency of the information demands more than an impulsive reaction. It demands a meticulous calculation. In silence, the superior absorbs the news, his mind already weaving the strategies necessary to deal with the sudden crisis. Surprise gives way to a calculating coldness, dissecting every fragment of the revelation. Under that sharp and relentless gaze, the next move is already being plotted. The decision culminates in an absolute order that cuts through the silence of the great hall. The unquestionable urgency of the command echoes through the empty space, demanding total submission and action without any room for hesitation. The imperative order is received with an obedience laden with ulterior motives. Under the guise of false hospitality, a trap begins to be orchestrated with a simple gesture, ensuring a grim reception for the approaching targets. Upon entering the premises, he assesses the environment with an air of superiority, visibly disappointed with what he finds. The supposed hospitality fails to impress him, and his arrogant posture makes it clear that the place is not up to his standards, creating tension in those who accompany him. His critical gaze falls on the modest arsenal at their disposal, confirming his worst expectations. The apparent fragility of the equipment makes him question whether those blades would withstand a single clash before shattering. The vast training field awaits in an almost mocking silence under the sunlight. It is on this grandiose stage that the demanding activities must take place, creating a bitter contrast with the sad reality of the available arsenal. A profound feeling of admiration takes hold of them before the monumental scale of the interior. The oppressive grandeur of the place serves as a humbling reminder of the immense power and wealth needed to maintain a private facility of that size. The silence of the monumental environment serves as a backdrop for his cautious thoughts. Far from being paralyzed by the oppressive grandeur, he silently analyzes the true weight of that place. Heavy footsteps echoed through the training yard, disrupting the routine of the place. The two young apprentices immediately stopped what they were doing, noticing the approach of an imposing figure who brought an aura of authority. The veteran instructor walked towards them deliberately. The presence of the third young master there in the yard caused an evident shock among those present, who were not expecting that sudden visit. The nobleman maintained a haughty and unwavering posture in the face of the situation. Meanwhile, his companion instinctively retreated, overcome by a palpable nervousness before the tension that was forming in the air. Upon noticing the hesitation, the older man flashed a malicious smile. He stared at the boys with the clear superiority of a predator cornering its prey, savoring the fear of others. The instructor then focused his oppressive attention on the more fragile apprentice. The boy shrugged, feeling the weight of that intimidating gaze crush any trace of confidence he possessed. Completely cornered, the young man looked away, unable to sustain eye contact. The psychological pressure exerted by the veteran was enough to break his defensive posture in a matter of seconds. However, the true target of that provocation was another. The veteran turned directly to the third young master, establishing a silent and extremely tense confrontation of wills in the middle of the training yard. With a tone full of mockery, the man demanded a reminder of the past. He used his position of authority to try to humiliate the nobleman, testing the limits of his patience. At first, the heir seemed to give in to the pressure. He wielded his wooden sword awkwardly, with his entire body trembling uncontrollably before the imminent threat. Satisfied with that apparently pathetic reaction, the instructor raised his hand to his face to contain his laughter. He firmly believed that he had broken the spirit of the young nobleman with extreme ease. However, the submission was just a farce. The tremor ceased abruptly, giving way to a dark smile that began to form on the lips of the third young master. The expression of fear disappeared completely, revealing his true nature. The nobleman displayed a predatory confidence, demonstrating that the attempt at intimidation was nothing more than a joke to him. In his mind, the heir reflected on the true nature of those warriors. He concluded with disdain that the knights, despite all the pomp, were just hunting dogs chained by their masters. He watched the recruits training exhaustively. Tradition dictated that these men, raised under strict codes of honor, should offer blind loyalty to the nobility that sustained them with wealth and status. Therefore, the instructor's insolent attitude was unacceptable. The young master decided it was time to remind the veteran of his true place in the hierarchy of that unforgiving world. A knight in heavy armor knelt in submission before a noble figure wielding a gleaming blade. The situation proved utterly unfavorable for the warrior, sealing the fate of that imposing confrontation. The young man silently reflected on the outcome of that clash. He understood that, in the end, circumstances had taken an inevitable turn, requiring a new strategy on his part. However, his calculating train of thought was suddenly interrupted. The boy cautiously averted his gaze, noticing a peripheral movement that demanded his immediate attention before taking the next step. Someone tapped the toe of their boot on the ground repeatedly. The rhythmic and insistent sound demonstrated a clear impatience and irritation with the attitude the young man had been displaying up to that moment. The instructor stared at the boy with deep indignation and disbelief. He considered the boy's posture extremely insolent, an unacceptable disrespect that needed to be corrected immediately to maintain order and discipline. The young man, in turn, maintained a completely relaxed posture in the face of the impending scolding. He showed no sign of being intimidated by the authority of the exasperated man in front of him. In his mind, the boy imagined a severe and sadistic punishment. He considered that a much crueler method of mental reconditioning would be the ideal response to deal with that audacity. The theory about cruel methods of punishment suddenly turns into a terrifying reality. The near-lethal impact of the surprise attack shatters the man's composure, making it clear that the warning about brutal reconditioning was not a mere bluff. The risky idea is quickly stifled by a paralyzing fear of the consequences. The mere memory of the Archduke's oppressive presence looms over him like a crushing threat, serving as a brutal reminder that certain transgressions would never be tolerated. The tension is palpable between those present, where furtive glances accompany the tense clash. The discussion about the severe punishment serves as a somber reminder that, under the Archduke's rule, no failure goes unpunished. A subtle clearing of the throat attempts to break the suffocating atmosphere that has settled in the environment. It's a restrained effort to disguise the discomfort and divert attention from the impending clash. Breaking the heavy atmosphere once and for all, the young man takes the lead in the situation with an unwavering stance. He assertively takes the floor, gesturing with the confidence of someone about to dictate the new course of the conversation. Urgency dictates the new rhythm of the meeting, demanding an immediate attitude in the face of the situation. With no room for hesitation, the need to move forward quickly becomes the absolute priority. In stark contrast to the tension of the moment, a light and relaxed laugh breaks the atmosphere of the hall. Far from being carried away by the rush, he gestures calmly, seeming to find a trace of humor in the sudden urgency that surrounds them. The true essence of swordsmanship transcends mere combat, revealing itself as a mystical heritage shaped by ancestors. By surrendering to these ancient movements, the practitioner not only achieves spiritual enlightenment, but awakens the true evolutionary potential of their own physical body. Legend had it that mana pathways closed at 16. For those who missed that deadline, any effort would be nothing more than mere physical training. Faced with this harsh reality, cruel words tried to diminish the hopes of a bright future. The arrogant instructor questioned the young man's age with disdain. To him, 16 was already too late for any magical ambition. The blonde boy listened to the taunts in silence, staring at the man who was trying to put him in his place. Satisfied with his own rhetoric, the older man made a theatrical pause. He clearly enjoyed the position of power he wielded at that moment, believing he had cornered the boy without leaving room for any kind of response or defense. Approaching with a wicked smile, the instructor whispered words laden with venom. He suggested that the boy's destiny would be to spend his days tending a garden, a mediocre and unworthy function for someone who dreamed of wielding magic. Meanwhile, the humiliating scene did not go unnoticed. Other members present in the courtyard watched the interaction with stern and judgmental looks. The tension hung in the air, but no one dared to intervene in the public reprimand that was unfolding. The mockery continued to echo through the place, reinforcing the idea that the boy was only good for manual labor. The spectators absorbed each offense uttered, consolidating the image of failure that they were trying to impose on the young apprentice. The protagonist remained motionless, his back to his tormentors. The cruel lesson of the day was that each individual possessed a predetermined role in the world, and his, apparently, had already been decided by those who considered themselves superior. The lackey crossed his arms, overflowing with arrogant confidence. He believed he had crushed any trace of rebellion or hope in the boy's heart, proud to have fulfilled his role of keeping the hierarchy intact through fear. However, behind the apparent submission, a spark of clarity shone. The young man realized that all that intimidation was nothing more than a farce. The truth hidden beneath the offenses was about to change the course of that conversation. Until that moment, he had been treated like a helpless and pathetic little animal. In everyone's eyes, he was just a fool, paralyzed by his own ignorance, unable to formulate a single word of protest against his oppressors. Being ridiculed by a mere lackey and freezing in fear was a shameful display. Repeating the same failure as the previous year, serving as a spectacle for the onlookers, was a weight that the boy was no longer willing to carry. Breaking the oppressive silence, the protagonist finally spoke. With sharp logic, he concluded aloud that, given the circumstances presented, there was absolutely no impediment for him to begin his magical learning at that very moment. The aura of submission disappeared instantly. With his face obscured by a new determination, the boy took control of the situation. The unexpected response caught everyone by surprise, breaking the power dynamic that the instructor tried to establish. The arrogant man blinked, visibly confused. The young man's audacious response completely disarmed his line of reasoning. Scratching his head, the lackey tried to process how his attempt at humiliation had turned into a demand for teaching. With a quick and firm gesture, the boy ended the discussion. The confident attitude made it clear that he would no longer accept being treated as useless. From that moment on, the rules of the game had changed definitively. The blond man grabbed the young man's head menacingly. With a tone of disdain, he declared that the house of Valdek was doomed to ruin. The boy trembled under the cruel grip. The aggressor then made it clear that the victim had no choice but to agree with that terrible realization. Suddenly, the blond man grabbed his own head in an apparent fit of hysteria. He began to scream, mocking that even a stray dog would know that information. The screams echoed around the imposing stone property. The uncontrolled individual continued to loudly disdain that knowledge that he considered completely flawed and useless for the situation. The boy and an older man approached, observing the scene with obvious confusion. Meanwhile, the aggressor staggered backward, seeming to completely lose control of his actions. Regaining his posture abruptly, the man grabbed his own clothes tightly. He then incisively questioned the veracity of the words that had been spoken to him. With a disturbing smile on his face, he revealed his position of authority as the son of the local lord. The noble directly threatened them, warning that it would be immense foolishness to try to deceive him. The atmosphere instantly became heavy in the open courtyard. The noble maintained his intimidating posture, cornering the older man and the boy while awaiting a response to his accusations. The mustached man was sweating cold, feeling the weight of the intimidation. Realizing that he was in a dangerous position, he recoiled slightly, desperately trying to formulate an acceptable justification. The knight tried to justify himself, claiming that the situation was simply unbelievable. However, the noble maintained his sinister gaze and mocked the honor of the House of Valdek, calling their tricks pathetic. The noble opened his arms in an exaggerated and theatrical manner. He was clearly amused by the situation, using his power to humiliate and toy with the despair of those he considered inferior. Feigning false indignation, the blond man put his hand to his chest. He dramatically questioned whether anyone there would dare blame him for his actions in the face of this supposed betrayal. The young man listened to the accusations in shock, unable to react. The noble's speech made it clear that this conflict threatened the very foundation of the domain in which they lived. Without showing any mercy, the noble pointed his finger directly at the older knight's face. The final accusation had been made, cornering the man with no chance of escape. The knight gritted his teeth tightly, sweating with pure rage and frustration. He realized that he was completely cornered and humiliated, unable to retaliate against the Lord's son's authority. The young man smiled arrogantly, taunting the newcomer about his unexpected presence there. He seemed genuinely pleased to test the limits of other people's patience right from the first meeting. In response, the man maintained a cold and unwavering posture. He stared at his interlocutor with obvious contempt, refusing to fall for the cheap provocations directed at him at that moment. He assessed the situation in the courtyard with a calculating gaze. The tension in the air was palpable as the opposing sides stared at each other in silence, waiting to see who would make the first move. Breaking the heavy silence, one of the subordinates rushed hastily towards him. The man showed a clear desperation to appease the situation before things got completely out of control. The subordinate tried to justify himself quickly, stammering flimsy excuses. His dread of the authority present was evident, fearing the consequences of having failed in his most basic obligations. However, a simple and firm hand gesture was enough to interrupt the chatter. The movement demanded absolute silence and immediate obedience, nipping any attempt at explanation in the bud. Jordi Valdek, the second young master of House Valdek, gave a subtle smile. He seemed to find a perverse amusement in the despair of others, showing how little he cared about the excuses. The noble clenched his fist tightly, containing his emotions. He inwardly savored the expression of pure terror that his mere presence and reputation had caused in the local staff. Immediately afterwards, the heir drastically changed the tone of the conversation. He gave a stern and clear warning that he would no longer tolerate any behavior that shamed his name again. The young master's disappointment was overwhelming and laden with threat. This forced the subordinate to swallow hard and try to regain what little composure he had left. Meanwhile, attention turned to the other side of the courtyard. The initial instigator remained still and confident, awaiting the unfolding of this display of power with an almost predatory interest. Behind him, a lackey was trembling uncontrollably, seized by panic. The servant was begging for instructions from his master in the face of the Dan. The subordinate's despair does not affect him in the slightest. Far from feeling any fear, the master finds only sadistic amusement in the impending crisis. The supposed threat is just a detail that fits perfectly into his plans. The master's refined posture masked the true darkness of his nature. Preceded by a reputation for ruthless cruelty, he advanced with the tranquility of one who revels in imminent chaos. The dry sound of his step marked the end of his approach, establishing the tension of an impending confrontation. Face to face, the master's oppressive presence finally met its target. The inevitable confrontation finally took shape in the courtyard. The newcomer positioned himself unyieldingly before the young master and his lackey, establishing a clear barrier of authority between them. Confident in his own superiority, the instigator gave a smile laden with arrogance. He believed he had the situation under total control, completely underestimating the opponent in front of him. However, the silver-haired man responded with a greeting laden with coldness. His somber expression and threatening tone made it clear that he was not there to participate in childish games. The tension in the environment increased dramatically and suddenly. The newcomer openly questioned the stupidity of that approach, exposing the immaturity of the young noble's actions before everyone present. Without hesitation, the man revealed that he had witnessed every detail of the previous machinations. The direct and relentless statement served as a devastating blow against his opponent's false confidence. A mocking smile subtly appeared on the newcomer's face. Realizing that the young master's plan had completely collapsed, he savored that brief moment of absolute superiority. The unexpected revelation hit the instigator head-on, quickly destroying his arrogant posture. The noble recoiled in shock, while his lackey trembled in panic just behind his tense back. Maintaining absolute control of the interaction, the older man observed the pathetic reaction of his opponents. The balance of power had completely shifted in his favor at that decisive moment. The newcomer's intimidating aura did not only affect the arrogant young master. Even the guards and subordinates present in the courtyard recoiled, visibly tense with the unfolding of that dangerous situation. However, the man soon regained his usual composure. He closed his eyes for a moment, peacefully demonstrating that he did not consider that dispute worthy of greater effort or wear. Then, he gave the boy a sharp and definitive look. That silent gesture served as a severe warning about the serious consequences of crossing his path again. To seal his victory, the newcomer invaded the noble's personal space, touching him on the chest with disdain. It was a calculated humiliation to break any remaining shred of pride. The calculated humiliation fails to break his spirit, igniting only an icy contempt. Instead of recoiling, he absorbs the insult in silence, coldly assessing his opponent's audacity. Beneath the facade of unshakable composure, the promise of a merciless retaliation is already taking shape. A diplomatic intervention cuts through the heavy atmosphere, seeking to appease the spirits of the spectators after the conflict. The public apology diverts the crowd's attention, transforming the impending tension into a cautious pause. The declaration echoes through the hall, redirecting the focus and dissipating the tension with an undeniable truth. House Valdek not only survived but stands tall, represented by the men who now draw all eyes. Jordi Valdek observed the situation with unwavering calm. The noble did not seem at all affected by the tension that was forming in the environment, maintaining his cold and calculating posture in the face of what was to come. A mocking smile soon took over his face. The heir found the attempt at intimidation completely pathetic, demonstrating that he was in absolute control of that silent and tense confrontation. Meanwhile, the instigator returned the look with a somber and defiant expression. The young man seemed eager to test his opponent's limits, viewing the whole situation as a dangerous game. Suddenly, the scene changed. The instigator recoiled, putting his hands to his head in an apparent fit of frustration, while his lackeys tried to support him in the face of the overwhelming pressure that had settled in. The newcomer then made a firm gesture, pointing to the guards and spectators gathered in the courtyard. He made it clear that there were witnesses to any reckless behavior that might be taken there. However, the young blonde's apparent frustration was short-lived. He quickly regained his composure, flashing a new confident smile as he formulated a different strategy to destabilize his target. Jody stared at him with extreme seriousness, refusing to fall for his opponent's sudden mood swings. The heir patiently awaited the next move, maintaining his firm and unwavering stance. Stepping forward, the provocateur assumed a theatrical and confident posture. He tried to justify his actions by involving the names of others, seeking to validate his position before everyone present. Upon hearing the justification, Jody's patience finally ran out. A menacing aura took over the nobleman, revealing that the provocation had crossed a dangerous and unacceptable line. Without backing down, the young blonde raised his voice in a tone laden with sarcasm. He offered false praise to his brother, using irony as his main weapon to publicly humiliate him. The audacity of that statement deeply shocked the onlookers present. The guards and servants exchanged nervous glances, realizing clearly that the family dispute was about to spiral completely out of control. Far from being intimidated by the theatrics, the newcomer flashed an icy smile. He decided it was the perfect moment to teach the provocateur a definitive lesson, accepting the challenge. The opponent, noticing the drastic change in atmosphere, prepared for the imminent clash. He adjusted his clothes with a quick gesture, showing that he would not back down from the fight he had provoked. The two finally stood face to face in the middle of the weapons courtyard. The distance between them decreased drastically, solidifying the tense direct confrontation that had been brewing from the start. A suffocating tension hung in the air as the two exchanged deadly glances. In that decisive instant, it became evident that only one of them would emerge victorious from that intense power struggle. The newcomer stared the young provocateur up and down, exuding an aura of pure intimidation. The tension in the atmosphere reached its peak, making it clear to everyone present who really held absolute control of that situation. With a dark look, the man left an implicit and threatening warning. He revealed that he knew he was being watched lately, and more importantly, stressed that he had absolutely nothing to lose in a possible direct confrontation. Faced with that overwhelming pressure, there was no other alternative. Hesitant steps marked the immediate retreat of those who, moments before, flaunted arrogance in the hall, realizing that the danger before them was very real. The young provocateur completely abandoned his noble posture and began a desperate escape. Dragging his lackey along, he shouted a hasty farewell to Jody Valdec, seeking to escape that suffocating atmosphere as quickly as possible. The hurried footsteps echoed across the stone floor as they fled. The pair accelerated their retreat, leaving behind any shred of dignity in exchange for the guarantee of their immediate safety. Amid the panic, the nobleman shouted at his servant to run even faster. The lackey, completely terrified, could barely keep up with his master's frantic pace during the comical and desperate retreat. Meanwhile, the mustachioed subordinate watched the scene in silence. Seeing the newcomer's back, a cold sweat ran down his face, revealing the nervousness that the display of power had caused him. However, the servant's relief was short-lived. The mysterious man turned his attention directly to him, advancing so imposingly that the subordinate lost his balance and completely succumbed to fear. The newcomer's presence became even more oppressive, emanating an almost murderous aura. It became evident that his patience had run out and that the subordinate would need to deal with the serious consequences of his actions. Later, the apparent tranquility of the sunny gardens of the immense property contrasted sharply with the chaos and oppressive tension that had just occurred in the internal corridors of the mansion. Far from immediate danger, the young provocateur and his servant walked quickly through the outdoor area. Despite the safe distance, the posture of both still demonstrated the strong residual tension from the frightening encounter. The lackey, still deeply traumatized by the pressure he felt, constantly looked over his shoulder. He needed to make sure they weren't being followed by the dark-eyed man. Suddenly, the firm steps ceased abruptly on the dirt path. Something completely unexpected interrupted the pair's hasty escape through the property's garden, forcing them to stop and assess the new situation. The urgency of the escape gives way to an icy and calculating attention. Faced with the unforeseen obstacle in the garden, the focus narrows, silently assessing the new variable that has just crossed their path. The calculating silence is abruptly shattered by an explosion of raw emotion. Unable to bear the tension of the moment, the boy gives in to absolute panic, letting his anguish overflow in a desperate cry. The lackey, in absolute panic, expressed his terror over the consequences of his actions. He feared being erased from existence by a frightening night. Jordi Valdec only listened to the crisis of despair in silence. The subordinate's mind traveled to dark scenarios. He imagined the cruel fate that awaited those who failed their masters, begging in vain for mercy before implacable figures. The fear of imprisonment and total ruin weighed heavily. The vision of ending up rotting in a dark and cold cell was a very real possibility for disgraced servants. However, instead of punishment or contempt, an unexpected reaction arose. The nobleman flashed a gentle smile, clearly demonstrating that he did not share the same cruelty that terrified the young lackey. The boy, with his face bathed in tears, looked up completely desolate. He expected the worst, feeling the weight of his vulnerable position crush any hope he had left. Surprising everyone on the scene, Jordi Valdec crouched down to the servant's level. The heir extended his hand peacefully, offering genuine help instead of the expected retaliation against the trembling lackey. With an understanding expression, the young master verbalized a harsh truth of that world. He recognized that, in disputes between the powerful, it was always the innocent subordinates who ended up paying the highest price. To seal his words, the nobleman stroked the boy's head tenderly. The lackey widened his eyes, shocked by that gesture of affection coming from someone of such superior status. Jordi's expression then hardened into an unwavering determination. The heir made a silent decision about the type of leader he wished to become from that moment on. The boy absorbed the impact of that attitude. The master's genuine kindness broke down all his defenses, replacing the absolute dread with a nascent feeling of deep admiration and relief. Under the sunlight, the nobleman established his definitive personal oath. He decreed that he would never allow the people under his protection to be disrespected or live tormented by constant anxiety. With a firm pull, Jordi helped the boy to his feet. By calling him by name, the heir sealed a new pact of loyalty, inviting Hans to work together from then on.